When we talk about the America-Venezuela conflict, it's important to slow down and not see it as a single event or a sudden fight. This conflict is really a long story, shaped by history, resources, ideology, and power, and it reflects how the modern world works. Let's begin with Venezuela itself. Venezuela is not a poor country by nature. In fact, it is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world because it sits on enormous oil reserves, among the largest on Earth. For most of the 20th century, oil defined Venezuela's relationship with the outside world, especially with the United States. American oil companies were deeply involved in extracting and exporting Venezuelan oil, and Venezuela became economically tied to the U.S. market. During this time, Venezuela was considered a relatively stable democracy compared to many other Latin American nations. At the same time, the United States viewed Latin America as its sphere of influence. This idea goes back to the 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said, external powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. would play the dominant role there. Over time, this turned into a habit of intervention, political, economic, and sometimes military, whenever U.S. interests felt threatened. Now we move to the late 1990s, which is where things truly change. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. Chavez came to power, promising to fight inequality, corruption, and elite control of wealth. His ideology was socialist, nationalist, and strongly anti-imperialist. He argued that Venezuela's oil wealth should benefit ordinary people, not foreign corporations or a small domestic elite. Chavez nationalized the oil industry, reduced the role of American companies, and used oil revenue to fund social programs like education, healthcare, and housing. For many poor Venezuelans, life genuinely improved in the early years. But from the U.S. perspective, Chavez was deeply problematic. He criticized American foreign policy openly, built alliances with Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran, and positioned himself as a leader of resistance against U.S. dominance. This created not just an economic conflict, but an ideological one. The U.S. saw Chavez as a threat to liberal democracy and free markets. Chavez saw the U.S. as an imperial power exploiting weaker nations. After Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolás Maduro took over. This is where Venezuela's internal problems worsened significantly. Maduro inherited an economy that depended almost entirely on oil. When global oil prices collapsed around 2014, Venezuela's revenue collapsed with it. Instead of reforming the economy, the government doubled down on controls, printing money to cover deficits. Corruption increased, institutions weakened, and political opposition was increasingly suppressed. Elections under Maduro were widely criticized as unfair. Protesters were jailed, media freedom declined, and trust in democratic institutions eroded. This gave the U.S. and its allies moral and legal justification to escalate pressure. Rather than sending troops, the U.S. chose a modern weapon: economic sanctions. Sanctions targeted Venezuelan leaders, banks, and most importantly, the state oil company. Since oil made up the majority of Venezuela's income, cutting oil revenue was meant to force the government into change. On paper, the idea was simple. If the government loses money, it can't survive. But economies are not just governments. They are people. As sanctions tightened, Venezuela's ability to import food, medicine, and spare parts collapsed. Inflation spiraled into hyperinflation, making salaries nearly worthless. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. Power cuts became common. Over time, millions of Venezuelans fled the country, creating one of the largest migration crises in modern history. Supporters of U.S. policy argue that Venezuela's collapse was inevitable due to corruption and mismanagement. Critics argue that sanctions accelerated and deepened the suffering, punishing civilians far more than leaders. Now let's zoom out and look at geopolitics. Venezuela did not exist in isolation. As U.S. pressure increased, Venezuela leaned more heavily on Russia, China, and Iran. These countries provided loans, military cooperation, and diplomatic backing. For the U.S., this was unacceptable. A resource-rich country in its own region aligning with rival powers challenged American strategic dominance. This is where the idea of America acting like a global police becomes clearer. The U.S. enforces sanctions worldwide, pressures other countries not to trade with Venezuela, seizes oil shipments, freezes assets, and threatens penalties for anyone who breaks its rules. These actions are often taken without full international consensus, relying instead on U.S. power over global finance and trade. From the U.S. perspective, this is leadership, maintaining order, protecting democracy, and preventing instability. From Venezuela's perspective, it feels like economic warfare and loss of sovereignty. Oil remains central throughout all of this. Control over oil isn't just about profit, it's about global energy security. Whoever controls oil supply influences prices, trade, and political stability far beyond their borders. Venezuela's oil, therefore, is not just Venezuela's problem. It is part of a global system. The conflict also raises big moral and legal questions. Does a powerful country have the right to economically isolate another country because it disapproves of its government? Where is the line between promoting democracy and enforcing dominance? If sanctions cause humanitarian crises, who bears responsibility? These questions don't have easy answers, and that's why the conflict continues without resolution. In the end, the America-Venezuela conflict is not just about Maduro or U.S. presidents. It is about how power works in the international system, how resources shape politics, how ideology clashes with interests, and how ordinary people often pay the highest price. It shows us a world where might still matters, even when wrapped in the language of democracy and human rights. That's why this conflict matters far beyond Venezuela or the United States. It reflects the deeper structure of global politics itself.